Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I am going to pick up where I left off at my streamed table of the 50K PPC on the Stone Cold Bubble, and in this video we have shifted to one of my favorite games, No-Limit Deuce-to-Seven Single Draw. Normally I would say one of my favorite games, however, I will say on the complete bubble this is definitely a very dangerous game, because obviously one of the few games in the mix where you could definitely go broke no matter your stack size. And if we take a look at the stack sizes here on the Stone Cold Bubble, we can see I'm kind of maintaining the position that I had in the last video I mentioned, as this only happened a little bit later in the session. I'm in average stack, or maybe a little bit above average. At this stage, maybe a little below average, but basically in a healthy position, but not doing so well that I can really get out of line at all. And I've got the massive chip leader, Albert Daher, on my immediate right. So we're going to look at this hand here, and in this no-limit single draw round, Daher's been showing down good hands, but he finally opens a light hand in this situation, although I didn't know it at the time. We can see here that he's coming in for a steal with a very, very light holding. And I would just pause here to note that I think this is totally fine. In big bet, you can put way more ICM pressure on your opponents, and no limit single draw is certainly a game in which people need to overfold their equity to avoid running into a disaster situation on the bubble. On the other hand, I pick up a very difficult hand to play here in the cutoff position. I pick up Jack 9, 6, 5, 3, and we can see here in the video, I'm going to pause it for a second while I talk to you, but we can see here that I end up tanking for some time trying to decide what I want to do with this hand. This was a bit of a while ago, but I can kind of remember my thought process in the situation was, whenever you have a hand like this, I could consider a very nitty fold, of course, but I think that would be maybe a little bit too tight, given the chip leader should be opening quite wide, and I have enough depth in my stack to still play some poker. I mean, we can see that with the blinds being smaller in the big bet game, I have something like 70 big blinds here, so it's not like a situation where I'm basically gonna be all in it, necessarily in this hand. At the same time, 3-betting here struck me as slightly concerning, because my hand is very difficult to decide what to do facing a 4-bet, right? If we were more shallow and it was for chips, like if I'm playing in a cash game and I'm playing 30 big blinds deep, my hand plays fine as a 3-bet. It might even play fine as just a 3-bet shove, even though that might be a little bit deep, because I'm in position, and if my opponent calls and pats in front of me, I have a very clear decision. I can draw one to the 9, 6, 5, 3. I will almost always be live. Every now and then I'll be dead. That's part of life. But my hand is very easy to play. If my opponent draws one in front of me, I stand pat and take my equity. However, at this depth and on the Stone Cold Bubble, I thought that this was a much more difficult situation, because I would have been tempted to continue with my 4-card 9, but I wouldn't have been sure that it was right, and I would have been a little bit worried about the reverse implied odds of drawing to a hand that could get me broke. So after thinking about it for a long time, I came up with a call, and I think my plan here was relatively clear. I was mostly going to draw one to the 9, 6, 5, 3, if my opponent stood pat or drew 1. If my opponent drew 2, I was probably going to stand pat and hope that I had enough traps in my range to make my play a little bit scary, and to make sure that I wouldn't just be auto-faced with a huge bet on the river, which would be a very difficult decision. I think that this is at this stage of the tournament, I don't think I'm giving away a lot of information by taking my time here pre-flop and waiting to think about my options here. If I had a monster, I could certainly flatten the spot too, although it would be, of course, rare. Then we see Bryn Kenny here in the small blind picks up quite a strong hand, and obviously this is not going to go so well for me given the strength of his hand versus the weakness of my draw, especially after flatting. Although I should say I'm quite happy that I flatted here given the results. If I were to have 3-bet here, then Kenny would certainly 4-bet, and I'm not sure whether he would 4-bet small or just 4-bet jam. With his stack size, I'm thinking he would still 4-bet small. Obviously, with ICM considerations, he would want to play a little bit of stack preservation, and both of us would be at least a little bit wary of Albert Daher having a monster in the situation. I'll jump over here to StudFlopDraw Alpha to take a look at how my Jack 9, 6, 5, 3 is doing. In game, I was trying to estimate my equity, and I thought it was probably going to be a little bit like this situation here. We can see that against the top 25% range from my opponent, I have about 50% equity. And to go further, StudFlopDraw does something kind of cool, which it shows a split decision here depending on what the drawing decision in front of me would be, since this is the in-position hand. So we can see here 76% of the time I would pat, 24% of the time I would draw one. At first I was a little confused what those numbers meant, but I came over here and plugged it into the single draw equity calculator, and when I looked at my opponent's range, it became clear. If I put it in top 25% range for the OOP player, we can see that he draws one 76% of the time, and his pat range is 24%, so now this makes more sense. Basically, the algorithm for StudFlopDraw has determined that this hand will have more equity patting against a D1 and D1 against a pat, and that is certainly the way I would have viewed it in game as well. We can see that my assumptions for Albert's range are way too nitty, of course. If we expand his range to something like top 50%, which might be a little bit more realistic, we can see my equity jumps a lot, right? Because now my Jack 9 6 5 3 is much more likely to run into a D2 or a very, very rough D1, or certainly some very rough pats that I'm completely crushing. So I mean, this is a lot of equity, guys. 58% equity here against a wide range. However, I do think with the ICM considerations, not 3-betting is still a very reasonable decision. Even with this much equity, it's not going to be like a situation where I just get to auto-realize my hot-cold equity. Like, I'm often going to, have to play the post-draw and can be led into for large sizes. Albert is definitely a very, very strong high-stakes, no-limit, big-bet player and is going to go for big sizes using his stack size. So, that's the analysis for the situation, but I think that it is a reasonable course of action. As we go back to the hand here, we see Kenny comes with a 3-bet in the small blind, of course, super reasonable. A little bit on the small side, to be honest, but given the ICM considerations, I think it probably just makes sense. For chips, you would probably want to go a little larger. He goes to 235K here, as you'll see in a moment. I do think you would want to go a little bit bigger and possibly even just go for a 3-bet jam with this kind of a hand. This would be one of the best hands that you would 3-bet jam with in this situation. Your better hands would probably go for a small 3-bet. And now it's back to me after Albert snap folds. I have another slightly difficult decision here, given that I've kind of underrep my hand a little bit, right? I've played it passively, but if you start to think about the situation, I don't really think that it matters that much. I mean, he's going to have a tight range here for 3-betting out of position against two players, one of whom is the chip leader of the tournament and a very capable big bet player, and my range is not completely capped here. I do definitely have some traps in the situation, so after thinking about it for a long time, I just decided that my draw to the 9-6-5-3 did not have enough equity and just decided to fold. And we'll see that in a moment here. I'll just go back here, and if we take a look at maybe a much, much tighter range here of top 10%, we can see that my equity drops massively with this sort of a hand. These are obviously huge drops, and it makes sense. And now Villain's going to be pat much more often, and 50% of the time he's going to be pat in the situation according to StudFlopDraw's algorithm. And if we come here and edit this sim a little bit and look at how my equity is doing against top 10%, which might even, I'm not even sure if that's realistic. Oh, sorry, that was top 5. Let's do 10, stick with 10. And rerun. And we can see that when Villain is pat, I'm actually doing okay because he has a lot of other jacks. When I am pat, that means that Villain is drawing 1, right? So I have a slight equity advantage. I'm a slight favorite against his D1 range, although I'm going to have a big playing disadvantage having a weaker pat range against this very, very strong D1 range. He's certainly going to be able to jam into me on the river quite often. That makes it a very difficult situation. And when I'm drawing 1 because my opponent is standing pat, I only have 28% equity. So weighted equity is 40%, but I feel like it's going to be harder to realize this than what the hot and cold equity actually looks like. And as I said, as I go back to the video, after thinking about it for quite some time and weighing all my options, I never really considered 4-betting. I think that would be a little bit weird with my hand. I mean, obviously I would want to have some 4-bet bluffs in the situation because I already said I could have some traps, but I think the prudent course of action here was just to stay out of trouble, preserve my stack size. I'm in an okay position here on the bubble. There's really no reason to play a massive pot against another stack that's very similar to mine, and I would not expect to be really out of line in this situation whatsoever. And you can see that I just made the slightly nitty fold. And as we move on to the next hand, I'm just going to give you guys one quick piece of bonus coverage here because the next hand I was also involved in, and I noticed a couple things from it. The first is this. Albert gets dealt the Queen Jack 9-7-5 the very next hand after just opening a King Jack, and he's won position earlier, but he just got called in 3-bet, and this time he just decided to fold. And this is something that you're going to see very, very often from all sorts of poker players, but I find a little bit surprising sometimes from very good high-stakes players. I think that people are too accustomed to using the game flow to, affect their decisions, right? I mean, probably if you asked him, his thought process here would be something like, well, my image is a little weak now. I don't want to open another light hand. But the reality is that he is the massive chip leader on the Stone Cold bubble. He gets to open all sorts of hands, especially in the big bet rounds. And he has a player in the big blind specifically in João Vieira who has one of the shorter stacks and is certainly going to be very cautious, right? There's no reason in my mind for Albert to fold this hand after raising the previous one. I think this hand is obviously just better. It can pat against the D2, maybe even against the D1. And I just am a little bit surprised that he folded here. Anyway, he does decide to just fold this hand. And I get dealt an extremely similar hand. I get dealt Jack 9, 7, 6 deuce, and obviously a slightly better situation for me having it folded to me, and I decide to open for my standard size here, which is 45K. I'm basically min-raising as we get shallower. Here I added 5K more. I just think these small sizes are going to just do really, really well in a tournament situation. And if we look at some of the hands that are behind me and what happens here, you'll see what I mean. I'm not saying that anybody should have played their hand in this situation, but just by min-raising plus 1 chip, I get the 3, 3, 4, 8 on the button to fold. This would be an okay 3-bet bluffing hand from Bryn here for sure, or calling and drawing 2 hand would certainly be a consideration at other stages of the tournament. I get Eric Lindgren in the small blind to fold a 4-card 10, which has a ton of equity against me, and again would be for chips a fine hand to probably call with here in D1. And in the big blind, to top it all off, we have João Vieira, who has a very difficult hand to play with the 3-4-5-5. But if we just take a look at his equity in the situation against even a top 25% range, which is pretty reasonable for me, yeah, it's not great. He's got a 40th percentile hand, and he has about 32% raw equity. But given the pot odds that he's getting, I'm offering him a very good price to continue, and instead he just decides to watch out for the ICM of the tournament situation, not, lose any chips and fold. And with my very small open size here, I accomplish quite a lot. I take down 30, 40, 50, 60K in blinds and antes, risking 45. So just remember how profitable putting pressure on the bubble can be in this situation. I'm risking 45K to win 60, and I got a ton of equity to fold from a bunch of different hands. So kind of cool back-to-back 2 Jack 9 hands, one that worked out a little better for me, one that worked out a little bit worse. Let me know what questions you guys have. No Limit Single Draw is one of my favorite games, and in a tournament situation, I think it's a very fascinating game because there's all sorts of adjustments you can make from a cash game situation. So I'll see you guys in the comments, and thanks for watching.